So, if you wanted to predict who might actually join a violent extremist group.
You'd probably assume there's a very specific profile,
Right,
right?
exactly. You'd think, okay, I need to look for someone completely uneducated.
Yeah, highly isolated from the modern world.
Right. Maybe impoverished. Just someone who, simply doesn't know any better. But if you actually look at the data, that assumption is completely dangerously wrong.
It really is. It's backwards.
Yeah, if you really want to find the people filling the ranks of groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, you shouldn't be looking at the uneducated. You should actually be looking at the engineers.
The doctors.
Right? The doctors, the IT specialists. And welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring a really fascinating concept that true knowledge is actually society's strongest shield against extremism.
Yeah, and we're unpacking why, in an era where everyone carries a literal library in their pocket, the illusion of intellectual competence has just never been deadlier.
It's a massive blind spot, isn't it? Like, this profile of the highly educated extremist really forces us to confront how we view the world.
Oh, totally. I mean, we tend to think of ignorance as this blank slate. We treat it as a state of harmless neutrality.
Like a kind of innocence.
Right, exactly. But ignorance, particularly theological and philosophical ignorance, is a state of profound danger. I mean, superficial belief, which is basically half knowledge masquerading as absolute truth, it leaves a person incredibly vulnerable to manipulation.
Yeah. I want to trace the origins of how we got here, though, because there's been this massive shift in how humanity approaches learning. We have to travel way back, long before algorithms and echo chambers, to see how ancient civilizations viewed the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, they definitely didn't treat philosophy or theology as a weekend hobby.
No. Or like some general ed requirement you just get out of the way for a corporate job. It was an absolute non-negotiable duty.
It really was. There's this civilizational imperative that runs right through antiquity. So in the Islamic tradition, for example, there is a very famous, often quoted saying, seek knowledge even if it is in China.
Right.
Now, classical scholars are quick to point out that this specific phrasing about China isn't technically a verified prophetic quote, but
The spirit of it is real.
exactly. The spirit reflects an authentically verified and, frankly, much more radical command from the Prophet Muhammad, which basically states that acquiring knowledge is a duty for every Muslim.
Meaning everyone.
Everyone. It doesn't put geographical boundaries on it. It doesn't limit it to a specific gender or, social class.
Which, if you try to picture the reality of that command in late antiquity, it's just staggering. I mean, we are talking about an era long before commercial flights or paved highways.
No modern university systems either.
Right. Yet you have this one command sparking a civilization-wide drive. People were crossing deserts, enduring immense physical and financial hardships, and completely blowing past their cultural horizons just to learn.
And as that pursuit of knowledge just exploded across continents, the scholars of the time realized they needed to organize it. They had to build an architecture for it.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Well, the 11th century Persian polymath Al-Ghazali is super central to this. In his work on the religious sciences, he established a protective hierarchy of knowledge.
Okay.
He divided human learning into two fundamental categories. The first is ilm al-din, which encompasses theological, religious, and moral knowledge.
Right, the moral compass.
Exactly. And the second is ilm al-Dunya, which is worldly knowledge, so disciplines like medicine, astronomy, engineering, mathematics.
But he wasn't just creating like a library catalog for these, right? There was a strict order of operations here.
Oh, the order of operations is the crucial part. Building on a deep early tradition, including figures like Ibn Masud and later scholars like Ibn Rajab al-Ghazali, cemented a firm rule.
Which was?
That the moral and religious knowledge, the ilm al-din, is an individual duty that must be secured before a person takes on worldly responsibilities.
So before the worldly knowledge.
Right. You have to build the moral, grounded framework first. That way, when you acquire worldly power or scientific capability, you have the ethical capacity to actually use it responsibly.
Wait, but if you look at the modern education system, we do the exact opposite.
No, completely the opposite.
I mean, we push STEM science, technology, engineering, math, along with business as the absolute unquestionable priority. We structure our entire society around acquiring ilm al-Dunya.
We do.
And we treat deep moral ethics, theology, or philosophy as something you might, read about on vacation if you have time. So if we are churning out generations of students with massive technical skills but zero moral scaffolding, where do they end up? Like, has anyone actually tracked what happens when worldly knowledge operates in a moral vacuum?
Yeah, sociologists have tracked it, and the answer is exactly what leads us to the Global Terrorism Index data we mentioned at the start.
Oh, wow.
When you flip Al-Ghazali's hierarchy upside down, when you combine high worldly education with deep theological ignorance, you create the literal perfect psychological conditions for extremism.
That is, let's break down the mechanics of that. Why would an engineer or an IT specialist, someone trained to be highly rational, be more susceptible to radical, violent ideologies than someone without that education?
It comes down to a concept developed by sociologists Diego Gambetta and Stefan Hertog. They call it the engineering mindset.
The engineering mindset.
Yeah. People who undergo intense training in the hard sciences or technical fields are conditioned to expect clear, binary answers.
Right, like in computer science, it's a 1 or a 0.
Exactly. And in engineering, a structural calculation is either mathematically sound or the bridge collapses. It is strictly right or strictly wrong.
Which, I mean, is exactly what you want when someone is building a bridge, right? Or writing aviation software.
Absolutely. You definitely want binary thinking there. But it becomes disastrous when that exact same mindset is applied to ancient philosophy or scripture.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, when an individual with an engineering mindset who has zero theological training and no spiritual compass suddenly turns to ancient religious texts, they demand those same rigid, mechanical, binary solutions.
But religious texts are deeply metaphorical.
Extremely. They are nuanced, layered, and steeped in historical context.
So they're essentially trying to read a complex piece of poetry as if it were a technical instruction manual for assembling furniture.
That is the perfect analogy. And that's the mechanical failure at the heart of extremism. These individuals lack any grounding in hermeneutics, which is the science of interpreting texts. In the Islamic tradition specifically, they lack knowledge of asbab al-nuzul.
Let's define that term for a second because it's super important here.
Yeah.
Asbab al-Nuzul translates roughly to the historical context of a revelation, right?
Yes. It means understanding why a specific verse was revealed, when it was revealed, and what the surrounding circumstances were.
The messy human stuff.
Right. And because these extremists lack that tool, they just cherry pick. They will locate a single, highly specific verse that was revealed during a 7th century defensive war, strip it entirely of its historical circumstances, and apply it as a timeless, universal rule for everyday life in the 21st century.
Because the binary mind doesn't like context. I mean, context makes things messy.
Context requires interpretation, and interpretation requires admitting ambiguity. The engineering mindset just rejects ambiguity. These groups have no idea about the 1,400-year-old, highly complex scholarly tradition that was built specifically to navigate and moderate theological contradictions.
They just want the 1 or the 0.
Exactly. They want the code to compile.
You see the ultimate tragic manifestation of this in a group like Boko Haram. I mean, their very name translates to Western education is forbidden. You hear that and assume they must be this deeply traditional, fiercely theological movement.
But they aren't.
Right, they are. They are a political manifestation of ideologically weaponized ignorance.
The research really forces us to reconsider the entire narrative around radicalization. Religious violence almost never stems from an overdose of religious knowledge. It is born from an arrogant, deadly deficit of it. It's the disease of half-knowledge without reflection.
So if rigid binary thinking is the disease-causing extremism, the cure can't simply be to banish religion or philosophy from the public square.
No, definitely not.
Because if we do that, we just leave the binary thinkers entirely in charge of the texts. The cure must be to lean heavily into the inherent complexity of the material.
Yes, and modern scientific research is proving that those ancient scholars who demanded deep, complex study were entirely correct. Embracing complexity is our most effective defense mechanism.
Let's look at the mechanism of how that actually works in practice. Recent sociological studies, like those out of Coventry University focusing on religious education, show something amazing. They found that teaching the historical context of texts, teaching the Asbab al-Nuzul, and focusing on core values builds massive, measurable resilience against radical narratives.
It's a cognitive shield.
Yeah. But how does that actually play out in a person's mind? Like, practically?
Well, think about how a radical recruiter actually operates. They approach a vulnerable person, hand them a single, violent, out-of-context quote, and say, "This is the absolute, unvarnished truth of your faith, and you must act on it."
Right.
If that person lacks religious reading comprehension, they have no intellectual defenses. They just surrender to the quote. But if that person has been taught theological diversity, their brain automatically interrupts the recruiter.
They start asking questions.
Exactly. They ask, wait, who translated this? What year was this written? Which scholarly school of thought interprets it this way? The recruiter's spell is broken simply by the individual's ability to interrogate the text.
The resistance comes from the questioning itself. And we see similar findings from organizations like RE Online in the UK, as well as major research out of North-South University in Bangladesh. They investigated how theological education functions as a soft power tool against extremism.
And the Bangladeshi study reached a fascinating conclusion. They found that theological education only works against radicalization when it is narratively complex. Meaning, if a program just teaches us versus them, it fails. It has to say to the student, here is the vast theological diversity of our tradition. Here are the multiple, sometimes conflicting scholarly opinions. Now, use your intellect and judge.
When you expose people to the vast, multifaceted complexity of truth, they just no longer settle for cheap, hate-filled black and white lies.
They can't unsee the complexity.
Right. It's like treating an ancient text as a flat, two-dimensional map when it's actually a 3D globe. The extremist only sees the flat map. They think if you step off the edge of their specific interpretation, you just fall into the abyss.
But the true scholar sees the topography. They see the depth and the shadows of the globe.
And this demand for deep, three-dimensional complexity, it spans all major world traditions. It's really a universal human defense against tyranny. Like in Islam, the very first word of revelation wasn't a rigid rule or a punishment. It was ikra, which means read.
Yeah, a direct call to the intellect.
Exactly. And you see the same reverence for intellectual rigor in Judaism. The Talmud treats the study of Torah as the highest possible good. Its end in itself, not just a means to an end. And the rabbinic tradition practices machloket, the art of debate. Questioning and contradicting the text isn't seen as heresy. It is literally a holy act.
It's how you find the truth.
Right. Let's look at Maimonides, the great medieval philosopher. He wasn't just a theologian. He was a highly accomplished physician. He didn't compartmentalize his worldly knowledge from his religious knowledge. He completely synthesized medical science and deep faith, using logic to understand the divine.
And we see that exact same synthesis in Christianity. The Gospel of John begins with the logos, a term that translates to the word, but carries this much deeper Greek philosophical meaning of universal reason and divine order.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and thinkers like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas dedicated their entire lives to proving that reason and revelation do not contradict each other. Aquinas famously argued that reason and faith are like two wings that lift the human mind to truth. The entire European university system was basically built on that foundational belief in rational, complex inquiry.
Even outside of the Abrahamic faiths, classical and Eastern philosophy demand the exact same rigorous self-examination. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrates that attaining true knowledge is a painful, disorienting exit from the comfortable darkness of illusion.
It's not supposed to be easy.
No. Socrates anchored his entire worldview in intellectual humility, declaring, "I know that I know nothing." Lao Tzu warned in the Tao Te Ching that believing you know when you don't is an actual disease.
And Fuchsia summarized the danger perfectly, too. He said, learning without thinking is a waste of time, but thinking without learning is dangerous.
That dangerous thinking without learning is the exact definition of the extremist staring at the flat map. So, if we know that historical context, deep reading comprehension, and intellectual humility are the cures, how do we actually build this three-dimensional understanding today? Because we live in an era specifically designed by algorithms to feed us flat, 60-second black and white answers.
Well, there is an architecture for true understanding that acts as a blueprint here. It consists of three inseparable dimensions. And if you remove even one of these pillars, the entire structure of a person's worldview collapses right back into that dangerous binary.
Okay, what's the first dimension?
The first dimension is ilm.
Ilm, which translates directly to knowledge.
Right. It is the intellectual baseline. Ilm is the rigorous, exhausting study of the source texts, the grammar, the history, and the context. But classical scholars warn that true ilm isn't just hoarding information or memorizing facts to win arguments online. It is supposed to be the foundation for personal transformation.
Which requires the second dimension to actually function, right? Hikmah.
Yes, hikmah, which translates to wisdom. If ilm is the raw data, hikmah is the practical, nuanced application of that data to human life.
So how does that look in practice?
Well, knowing a religious rule or a legal boundary, that is ilm. But knowing when a person's circumstances are so exceptionally difficult that applying the rule requires mercy, delay, or leniency, that is hikmah.
Okay, I think the best way to visualize that relationship is that knowledge without wisdom is like a sports car without brakes.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, the more raw power and information you accumulate, the faster you go. But without the brakes of wisdom to navigate the curves of actual human reality, you become completely lethal to yourself and everyone around you.
The faster you go, the more damage you do, which is exactly why the third dimension is arguably the most difficult and the most absent in modern discourse, Tazkiyah.
Let's define Tazkiyah. How does it act as the brakes?
Tazkiyah is character building. It is the active psychological purification of the heart from arrogance, narcissism, and that toxic feeling of intellectual superiority.
Oh, wow. So it's an internal check?
Exactly. You can have all the ilm in the world and you can understand the mechanics of hikmah, but without tazkiyah, you will just use your knowledge to dominate others. It's the ongoing process that forces a person to turn raw knowledge into humble virtue.
And this three-part architecture is exactly what we are dismantling in the digital age. I've heard sociologists refer to this as the TikTokization of theology. It perfectly illustrates the loss of Tazkiyah.
Yeah, the format of modern social media is just inherently hostile to complexity. We are taking incredibly dense moral, ethical, and philosophical framework systems that literally took centuries to debate and refine, and we're forcing them into 60-second binary clips.
Right. Is this halal or haram? Is this strictly right or strictly wrong?
1 or 0.
1 or 0. We have entirely shifted where we place authority. Historically, you'd seek out a scholar who had spent decades developing ilm, applying hikmah, and demonstrating the humility of Tazkiyah. Today, the authority has shifted to the algorithm.
To Sheikh Google.
Exactly. People consult Sheikh Google or whatever influencer speaks with the most unearned confidence.
And the tragedy of this shift is the human output. We're producing an entire generation of people who are highly secularly educated. They have the ilm al-Dunya, but they are socially and spiritually alienated.
So what do?
They go online, gather up these isolated, completely out of context religious or philosophical facts, and they use them as weapons. They use them to dunk on strangers in comment sections purely to boost their own ego.
Because they possess data, but they lack Tazkiyah.
Completely devoid of tazkiyah. That behavior doesn't create enlightened believers or a more moral society. It just creates learned tyrants. They confuse the ease of locating a fact on their phone with the grueling, transformative struggle of actually understanding what that fact means.
It's the illusion of competence.
Right.
I mean, we feel smart because our phones are smart.
Right. We have to force ourselves to remember the unyielding hierarchy of the digital age because the platforms are never going to remind us.
What's the hierarchy?
Data is not information. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not understanding. And understanding is definitely not wisdom. You simply cannot scroll your way to wisdom.
Data is not information. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not understanding. And understanding is not wisdom. That hierarchy really clarifies the modern condition. The solution to the extremism, the polarization, and the social fracturing we see on the news every night isn't to push for less religion or to banish philosophy from public life.
No, the solution is demanding more depth from ourselves and our communities. It's having the courage to pursue serious theological and philosophical education and pairing that pursuit with radical intellectual humility.
Right.
The greatest teachers in human history, whether we're talking about Moses on Sinai, Jesus teaching in layered parables that defied simple explanation, Muhammad commanding his followers to read and seek knowledge, or Buddha deconstructing the complex mechanisms of human suffering, they all recognize that true knowledge is an active, demanding pursuit.
Ignorance isn't just a lack of facts.
No, it's a fundamental vulnerability to those who wish to control you.
I want to circle back to something that grounds this entire discussion. A quote from Imam Malik that really captures the essence of what we're talking about. He said, "Knowledge is not memorizing many narratives. It is a light. It isn't just the terabytes of data sitting in your pocket library. It is the light that allows you to see the topography of the 3D globe."
But that light does not turn on passively. It doesn't illuminate anything when you are just swiping through a feed. It requires the humility to admit what you do not know and the discipline to actually sit down and study the complexity of the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a direct question. Think about your own information diet right now. Look at what you consume today. What are you actually learning? What source, what book, or what profound thought has recently challenged you intellectually or spiritually? What has forced you out of your comfortable echo chamber rather than just giving you a dopamine hit by confirming what you already believe. The world wants to feed you flat maps and binary code. Don't just collect data. Seek out that light.